Major General William Pierce has been a commissioned officer in the United States Army for the past 27 years. Among the awards that he has received throughout his career has been the Distinguished Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, and the Distinguished Flying Cross. General Pierce was born in Stewart, Iowa in 1914. He attended UCLA from 1933 to 1937, where he was a part of the ROTC unit at that time and captain of the wrestling team. He was given a commission in the regular Army in July of 1938. After several peacetime assignments, in March of 1942, he was assigned to the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. He moved overseas and was responsible for guerrilla operations, espionage, sabotage, and other clandestine operations in support of the combat forces in northern Burma under General Stilwell. He was in command of the OSS Detachment 101 through the North and Central Burma campaigns until July of 1945. General Pierce was then transferred to the China Theater. He was responsible for OSS operations south of the Yangtze River, and he led a Chinese parachute commando unit into Nanking to operate that city. In 1949, he was transferred to the Central Intelligence Agency and was placed in charge of all training. From 1953 to 1959, General Pierce served in France and Germany. In 1962, he was promoted to Brigadier General. He was promoted to Major General last year. In July of 1964, in Washington, D.C., General Pierce assumed his present duties as Special Assistant to the Chief of Staff for Special Warfare Activities and Assistant Deputy Chief of Staff for Special Operations. Special operations include such things as guerrilla, counterinsurgency, and psychological warfare. As a part of his function in this job, he has been in close contact with the situation in South Vietnam, and he was last in South Vietnam only last month. General Pierce has also been appointed as the U.S. Army member on the Joint Defense Boards between ourselves and Canada, Brazil, and Mexico. He is also the U.S. Army delegate to the Inter-American Defense Board. I would now like to introduce Major General William R. Pierce. Thank you.
Mr. Boxer, Cadet Clark, fellow Bruins, and ladies and gentlemen. I consider it a distinct honor and pleasure to be with you here today. This is really the first time since I left the school or the campus in 1937 that I've returned for any prolonged period of time. And I might say that the University of California, and especially the UCLA campus, holds an especial meaning to me. Aside from the fact, of course, that it is one of our country's leading institutions of higher learning, it means other things, such as the many people that I met when I was in school here and who've remained as steadfast friends with me to this date. It also means such things as Dr. Robert Gordon Sproul, who was the president of the Greater University of California at that time, and whom I've always looked upon not only as a great educator, but really as one of the great Americans of our time. It also brings back to me such people as Dr. Mansfield, Coach Cease Hollingsworth, Briggs Hunt down here, and Bob Schaefer, who used to work down in the gymnasium, and many, many other people who offered me so much assistance and guidance when I was here attending school as an undergraduate, and I'm eternally grateful to them. Now, as you probably well recognize, things have changed a little bit since I was last here. At that time, the campus consisted of only 7 buildings as compared to this, what I would term a megapolis or something of that nature today. So it is quite evident to me, at least, that much progress has been made and is still being made. At that time, in the mid-30s, the Reserve Officer Training Corps consisted of about somewhere between 15 and 2,000 cadets, or you might say the strength of a stripped-down regiment And it was really quite an awesome sight to see all these units and all the personnel with all their flags and pennants and banners flying in their final parade on the parade ground here. And I might further say that the officers produced by this cadet corps made a tremendous contribution to the security of this country during the past war, and for that matter, to the security of the free world. In Burma, I had the opportunity to see and to work with approximately 15 of the people from UCLA, many of which I had gone to school with. During my allotted time here this morning, I propose to cover 3 subjects. First, to take a brief look at the ROTC, to consider it from the point of view of the student today. Secondly, to describe and discuss the Army Special Warfare Program, so that you, particularly those of you who are in the ROTC, will have a little firmer grasp of what might be expected of you when you're called to active duty. And thirdly, I will spend a few minutes on what I would refer to as the difficult to understand situation in Vietnam, so that you might have an understanding or an appreciation of what we're attempting to do in that particular area. Now, I believe it goes without saying that I'm quite an ardent supporter of the Reserve Officer Training Program. From the time I left the campus until the present date, nearly 2,000 ROTC students have graduated from UCLA. And when you consider the fact that over 50% of the roughly 110,000 officers in our Army today are products of the Reserve Officer Training Program, I think you can readily appreciate the value of this program to our national security and to our national defense. The United States Military Academy can graduate somewhere between 600 and 650 cadets each year to come into the Army. So I believe it is readily apparent that they can come nowhere near fulfilling the overall officer requirements for the Army. And for this reason, the Army has had to look to the ROTC to produce the vast bulk of its officer requirement. On an annual basis, the Reserve Officer Training Program throughout the country produces 22 times as many new officers for our Army as does the Military Academy. Or if we put it in a different way, 85% of the lieutenants or the younger officers in our Army today are products of the Reserve Officer Training Corps. The distinguished military graduates from the Reserve Officer Training Program alone more than double the number of graduates annually from the Military Academy. Now, I don't intend to try to play a numbers game with anybody here today, because I'm sure that you've all heard this phrase that you can prove anything with statistics. But I think some of these figures are somewhat meaningful, and I believe may be of somewhat value to you. Now, I think you can accept the statements that I've just made concerning the number of junior officers which come into the Army via the ROTC. But the question which would then logically follow, well, what about the top management in the Army? Here again, I think you will find that the ROTC is well represented. Today, there are approximately 100 general officers in the Army who graduated from the ROTC and entered into our Army. As a matter of fact, one of our most recent chiefs of staff, George Decker, was an ROTC graduate. Now, some other statistics which have been compiled concerning past ROTC graduates would indicate that about 15% of all of our ambassadors in foreign countries were product of the ROTC, as were approximately 10% of the members of our last Congress and 25% of our state governors. And furthermore, a recent survey based upon information in Who's Who and in Business Week developed the fact that 28% of our top executives in business and industry, and that is to say people who make between $100,000 and $300,000 per annum, which is a little difficult for me to understand, that 28% of those people included the ROTC program in their educational preparation. Now, as I say, these figures are meaningful, but considered in this light. They become particularly relevant when you consider that only an average of about 5% of those who are eligible to take ROTC actually participate in the program. Now, throughout my military career, I've been repeatedly asked two questions, and I think you might possibly be interested in these two. The first is, what caused you to choose the Army as your profession in life? Now, I can assure you that the answer to this is not simple now, and it wasn't simple then. It has many far-reaching and broad implications, you might say, on the higher level and on down to an individual's activities in every day walk of life. The first prerequisite, or the first requirement, however, is motivation. An individual must have a strong desire to serve his country in both time of peace and in war. And I must add that he must be willing to lay down his life in the defense of his country and the principles of his country if such become necessary. Now, aside from, you might say, this desire to serve, I believe that my decision was based principally upon the fact that, having seen the Army, this is a kind of life that I most enjoyed. It provides an individual an opportunity to work and live in the field, to travel throughout this country and throughout foreign countries, and here I must add that I think I've had my share of that, and also to work with men with no prejudice whatsoever as to an individual's background, his race, creed, color, religion, or otherwise. I think it is a kind of work that an individual can get a great deal of satisfaction out of, and wherein your promotions are based solely upon your individual ability. All in all, I believe is a most gratifying life. However, I do have some cautions. I don't think anybody should ever enter the Army with the idea of attaining security, individual security, or with the idea of making money. I have found that being in the Army, an officer gets enough money to live on and to obtain those things which are necessary in life. But to do so means that he has to live rather frugally, or what you might term close to the board. The principal return for an officer in the Army is not in a monetary sense. Rather, it is the satisfaction derived from one's service in the interest of the security and the defense of this country. Now, the other question. Do you find yourself at a disadvantage in the Army in competing with graduates from the military academy? And I will tell you categorically that the answer is negative. To my belief, this is a state of mind. If an individual or a person believes that the academy graduate has the upper hand, he in effect is working against himself. And this in turn will reduce his capability and his potential. I personally have never known a situation wherein an individual was favored because he graduated from the military academy or from any other institution, for that particular matter of fact. And I can also say that at the present time, in working in the Pentagon on the Army General Staff, I cannot at the present moment tell you those who are military academy graduates, those who came into the Army as officers via the officer candidate school, or those who were military graduates. And I can even go further than that, because I really can't tell you the difference between those who are regular Army officers and those who are reserve officers on active duty. Now, I do think, however, that it is quite natural for people who have known each other and who have worked together during their formative years in school to naturally gravitate toward one another. However, as I stated before, I have never encountered a situation wherein I felt this affected their professional judgment. Personally, I've enjoyed being in the Army, and in an equal sense, I've enjoyed competing with these people from different sources and from different walks of life. Now then, those of you who are currently in the ROTC program, when you complete your education here at the university, you will enter a period of active duty with the Army. Now, some of you, of course, will be offered regular Army commissions as distinguished military graduates. And the remainder will be called to active duty for a period of 2 years to serve with the Army at various posts and installations, most likely in the United States. During this period, I would commend to your attention for each of you to take a real close look at the Army and to evaluate the Army and to evaluate yourself from the possible point of view of applying for a regular Army commission. If your evaluation would indicate that you have the penchant for this particular type of work, and if you have the proper motivation for this kind of work, I believe you will find it most satisfying. This, of course, assumes that both you and your capabilities will be equally as well acceptable to the Army. Now then, turning to a different subject, the Army Special Warfare Program. I would like first to define a few terms. Can you see this slide all right? Counterinsurgency-wise, Army assets have been oriented toward combating communist-inspired subversive insurgency simply because the communists, finding themselves strategically blocked at the higher levels of war, have openly stated that they will attain their expansionist aims through what they term wars of national liberation. These are the wars of today, which are directed against our free world stability, and to our best estimate, these are the wars of the immediate future. The next one, unconventional warfare. Keep that on, will you please? We think of unconventional warfare primarily in the context of the hot war, in connection with behind-the-lines activities and organization of resistance movements, which is to say, guerrilla forces, underground movements, and things of that category. With unconventional warfare, there are two things to keep in mind. First, the Army must remain ready to pursue this type of activity should a full-scale shooting war occur. And secondly, many of the techniques and skills involved in unconventional warfare are likewise applicable to counterinsurgency. Psychological operations or propaganda are primary military means of influencing or obtaining the support of populations or people. From far back in military history, we know of their value in every form of warfare. Now, the overall responsibility for the conduct of these activities is Army-wide. That is, it involves every individual, every organization, every unit, and every activity within the Army, and all must be properly trained and oriented to carry out their particular function. Included within the Army is a small group of people who have been given selected training to specific tasks in the area of unconventional warfare and counterinsurgency. These are called special forces, and it will be this aspect of special warfare which I will discuss this morning. I have another reason for selecting this particular part, because I find that here on the campus there is a small group of people called the Bruin Rangers, which in their off-duty time, in their free time at nights and on the weekends, they have been studying in this particular area, emphasizing ranger-type work, special forces-type work, guerrilla forces, and things of this category. And I thought perhaps you might be interested a little more in this group of dedicated people. Before I begin on this, however, I would like to emphasize again that the special forces represent only a small portion of the Army's overall endeavor in these three activities which I just cited. Now, as a little sidelight, and to digress for just a minute, I heard a cute little situation in the Pentagon recently which might likewise fit your fancy. You know, on the Army staff, we get all kinds of letters coming in from people throughout the country. Some of them say, sort of, well, you bunch of clods, why don't you straighten out the situation in Vietnam why don't you build a tank of this particular variety? Why can't you get Africa straightened out? And then there are other people that will send in directions for the preparation of some small device which he's going to eliminate all the communist Viet Cong and a few other things. But the other day they had a letter in that was a little bit different. They had a letter that came in and said, I think it was addressed to Colonel Blackburn, and said, "Dear Colonel Blackburn, I am extremely proud of what the Army is doing today. What you're doing in Vietnam, I think, is really perfect." And then he went on to extol the virtues of what was going on in the Army. And then he said, "I would like to compliment you and all the men in your staff, and for that matter, all the people in the Army, for an excellent job." And he signed it down there, Jim Jones. And then he put a little postscript down at the bottom. And he said, "P.S. Please excuse the crayon. They won't allow us to use anything with a sharp point in here." Now, the development of these special forces, which I've just mentioned, is a relatively recent endeavor within the Army. Guerrilla warfare, however, is far from a new idea in our country. We have been fighting this type of warfare from our very inception as a country, from our American Indians to Aguinaldo in the Philippines at the turn of the century to chasing Pancho Villa in Mexico prior to World War I. World War II saw the employment of many phases of special warfare and the rise of guerrilla movements and underground movements in many areas of both Europe and Asia. The Officer of Strategic Services, or OSS, which was the unit that I had been assigned to, was responsible for infiltrating agents and U.S. liaison personnel to work with the underground and guerrilla movements in Greece, in Italy, in France, and also in Burma and in China. There was also a large U.S. Army-sponsored guerrilla movement in the Philippines. In addition, there were also several unrelated special mission units formed during World War II. For example, the first Special Service Force, jointly manned by about 1,700 U.S. and Canadian volunteers, was given intensive training in skiing, mountain climbing, demolitions, and hand-to-hand combat in preparation for sabotage operations in Norway. Although the Norwegian operations were canceled, the force did lead the assault on Kiska in August of 1943, and later, at the specific request of General Eisenhower, was transferred to the Mediterranean theater, where it distinguished itself both in Italy and later in southern France. Also, the 5307th Composite Unit, a force of about 3,000 personnel under the command of General Frank Merrill, and perhaps better known as Merrill's Marauders, was recruited to make long-range penetrations in Burma. These were called LRPGs, or long-range penetration groups. Entering Burma from India, the Marauders bypassed enemy lines and swung in on the flank and rear of the Japanese 18th Division. They engaged in approximately 5 major and 30 minor combat operations and assisted the American supported and trained Chinese 22nd and 38th Divisions in clearing the way for the building of the Lido or Stillwell Road and in seizing the strategically important airfield at a place called Michinau. A much larger unit of this type was General Wingate's Chindit Force. This was a division-sized unit consisting of 5 of these LRPGs. The Chindits, in conjunction with the 1st American Airborne Commandos, which incidentally was commanded by Colonel Flip Corcoran, who you remember in Steve Canyon, I believe, and Johnny Allison. These units operated freely behind the Japanese lines in both central and northern Burma. And I might say parenthetically here that in our work in northern Burma with OSS, we had a great deal to do with providing both guerrilla and other forms of clandestine support to both the Marauders and to General Wingate's force, along with the 1st American Airborne Commandos. Following World War II, the Army contributed to the very successful counter-guerrilla operations in Greece. And then, somewhat to our regret, we witnessed the effective use of guerrillas in Korea by the North Koreans. Then in 1951, the Army took the first step to activate a regular Army unit specially organized and trained for guerrilla warfare. As late as 1960, this force consisted of 3 under-strength special forces groups with a strength of only a little over 1,000 men. Following Khrushchev's now famous speech of 1961, in which he indicated support for the so-called wars of national liberation, the strength of the special forces was increased to almost 4,000. Subsequently, as our involvement in counterinsurgency operations increased in such areas as South Vietnam and so on, this buildup continued, and we now have 7 special forces groups organized and either deployed or area-oriented with a strength of about 8,500. How does this happen? Well, it's all right. I can handle it without here. If you'll just follow me here, I think we can do this without pointing to the map. You will notice here that there are 7 groups. Looking in the far east, you will see that the 1st Special Forces group is located in Okinawa, and they have the area generally of all of Southeast Asia. The 5th Special Forces group is located in Vietnam for operations in that area. Then you will notice down in Panama is the 8th Special Forces, which generally covers the area of Central and South America. The 10th Special Forces is located in Europe at Bad Tolz in Germany. And then you will see that there are 3 groups which are located at Fort Bragg. One group is oriented toward Africa, another toward the Middle East, and the 7th, it provides personnel and materiel support for all of the other Special Forces groups located overseas. The mission of the Special Forces is as shown on this slide. Initially, the Special Forces were oriented primarily toward the unconventional warfare operations, which are sometimes referred to as UW. This includes the interrelated fields of guerrilla warfare, resistance movements, and escape and evasion. Such operations are conducted in enemy-held or enemy-controlled territory and are designed to stimulate and support resistance movements against hostile governments or hostile forces. This still remains a prime mission for Special Forces, and in some cases, such as the 10th Special Forces Group, which you recall was located in Germany, their training is oriented almost exclusively toward this unconventional warfare type of mission. Today, however, our Special Forces must be prepared to accomplish a dual mission. The second mission, which is becoming increasingly important, is the conduct of counterinsurgency operations. In our present environment, and for that matter for the predicted future environment, counterinsurgency operations command an extremely high priority within the Army establishment. Now, from the point of view of communist revolutionary doctrine and tactics, there is nothing new about their subversive insurgency or so-called wars of national liberation. Any newness lies in the fact that our military establishment, and in particular your United States Army, has had to focus its attention on coping with the lower level of warfare on a worldwide and intensified basis. Now, these Army Special Forces are organized into teams of specialized, carefully selected individuals who are language trained and area oriented, and who possess a wide variety of skills required for the conduct of both unconventional and counterinsurgency operations. For command and control purposes, the teams are combined into Special Forces groups as shown on this slide. You will notice here that the strength of the Special Forces group is in the neighborhood of 1,573. Then looking down on the lower line, you will see that there is a headquarters company, an aviation company, and a signal company. And then you will also notice that there are 4 line companies. Further, you will notice that each of these line companies is divided into A, B, and C detachments. The B and C detachments are primarily for command and control purposes. The A detachments, of which there are 12 in each company, or a total of 48 in each group, they are the real backbone of the operation. These are the teams which are organized, trained, and equipped to work in the behind-the-lines areas or in remote areas to assist the indigenous people in developing resistance movements. Now, each of these teams has a strength of 2 officers and 10 men. They are trained in 4 basic skills, as shown here, in which there are 2 men in the detachment. You will notice on the left side there are 2 communication specialists, there are 2 demolitionist specialists, 2 weapons sergeants, 2 medical specialists, and then in the center you will see the intelligence sergeant and the operations sergeant and the 2 officers for a grand total of 12. And in addition, each of the individuals in these teams are cross-trained in at least 1 additional skill. Now, each Special Forces soldier is first airborne qualified before he can begin his specialist training. Specialist training lasts for about 10 weeks for demolitionist personnel and as much as 44 weeks for a medical technician. Upon completion of this training, he is assigned to one of the Special Forces groups for 14 weeks of basic unit and cross training. This training includes amphibious, swamp, jungle, and Arctic survival courses. Altogether, a minimum of 24 weeks and as much as 58 weeks of training are required to qualify a Special Forces soldier for an overseas mission or for assignment to an operational team. This intensive training equips the Special Forces team with the necessary skills which are to be passed on to the indigenous personnel with whom it will be working. Special Forces soldiers are primarily teachers, advisors, and coordinators. They are not small combat teams, which even today there are many people within the Army who have this misconception. Now, I have here a few slides actually of the Special Forces in the area they work in South Vietnam with the Montagnard, or the mountain people of the Central Highlands. I think this will give you at least a little idea as to what the terrain looks like, the environment, and the people with whom these Special Forces are working. This first slide, I think, will give you an idea of the terrain of the highlands. You will notice it is, for the greater part, mountainous, and also that it is covered with dense jungle. Here, this is one of the typical villages or defense areas which they're working in the highlands. These are some of the women of the Montagnard tribesmen who for centuries have lived quite apart from any idea of the Vietnamese central government. In order to gain the support of these Montagnard people, in view of the fact that they were opposed to the Vietnamese, so to speak, it was necessary for the Special Forces and their Vietnamese counterpart to initiate what we term civic action projects. And here you see a Special Forces soldier or medical technician and his Vietnamese counterpart administering aid and medical treatment to the village people. Here's another type civic action program which has to do with food growing and animal husbandry. Now, it was only when the trust of these people could be gained, or that we could gain their support, that any attempt could be made to bring these people in to start their training so that they themselves could develop the defense for their own village or their own hamlet. Actually, on that past slide, you just saw the first group that was coming in for their training. Now, these mountain people, they can get around very nicely in the jungle and in the mountains and so forth because this is their natural habitat. But They are very backward and primitive, and as a consequence, they have to be trained in modern weapons, in modern techniques, have to be trained in the basic techniques of tactics, how to set up defenses, how to carry out even small operations. After they have been sufficiently trained, they normally establish what is called the village militia to defend their home village and conduct patrols in the surrounding area. There are others of these which are become quite highly trained, and these are termed strike forces. Here you see a strike force. These units move around from village to village, cutting off the Viet Cong supply routes and picking up intelligence, conducting various operations of this sort, which is very important in this particular type of war in which they are engaged. This particular program, which started with the Montagnard, proved so successful that the Special Forces are now engaged in similar programs down in the Delta area of South Vietnam, and also have extended even further to the north and clear out to the coast. Now then, you will recall when I mentioned Special Forces, I indicated that they were only a small part of the overall Army effort in these activities. Actually, the Special Forces effort in South Vietnam represents less than 10% of the overall effort in South Vietnam, the U.S. Army effort. So I think then the logical question is, well, what do the other 90% of the people do? Now here you see a map of South Vietnam. You will notice the 4 Roman numerals. Those represent the Vietnamese Army Corps, or Corps zones, starting with 1 or I Corps in the north, then 2, 3, and 4 down to the south, 4 being in the Delta area. Each of these corps will have 2 or 3 divisions assigned to it. Now then, as far as the American personnel are concerned, each of these corps will have an advisory team working with them. The advisory team will assist the commander in planning and in the conduct of his operations. There are also other advisors there with the corps team working with the Vietnamese personnel section, the intelligence, the operations, logistics, civic action, psychological warfare, and all of the other aspects which go into the makeup of a military operation. Then down below the divisions there are, of course, the regiments, and with each regiment we find another team, smaller of course because of the smaller organization. And then going down still further, we find that each of the battalions likewise have a small advisory team. In addition to the units assigned to these corps, there are also some separate battalions of Rangers, Airborne, Marines, and there are also some Special Forces. And each of these likewise have advisory personnel assigned to them to work with them, assist them, and so forth in the conduct of their operations. I might also say that the United States Navy, they are present to assist the Vietnamese Navy and also to assist them in what are called the river patrols and also in the conduct of the operations of their junk fleet. The Air Force is doing a similar job with the Vietnamese Air Force. So that I think you can say that the first job that the Americans are doing in South Vietnam is that of providing advisors, that is, assistance and support to the conduct of their operations. Now, politically, South Vietnam is divided into provinces which you might compare to our states. And beneath the province is the district, which you might compare to a county. Militarily speaking, and I might say that there are 48 provinces. Each province is further subdivided into these districts. They may have as few as 2 districts, and they may have as many as 11 districts. Militarily, the province is known as the sector, and the district is known as the subsector. Now, at the province or the sector level, there is also a U.S. Army advisory team working with the province or the sector chief in conducting his military operations. He has available to him what are called regional forces, that is, companies which he is authorized to raise, train, equip, and so forth for operations within his province. And also, they will have what are called popular forces. Those are forces which are raised in a local village or hamlet for the defense of that particular village. They do not leave. So the American personnel at this level generally assist in the conduct of these operations, and likewise in planning intelligence, psychological operations, and things of this category. Now then, going down to the district or the subsector, we also find that they have small advisory teams there. These teams, in addition to carrying out this military function that I mentioned, are also involved in providing assistance and guidance in such things as public health, sanitation, education, public safety, and all of the other things which go into the makeup of, you might say, a community or a society. And you can readily visualize that these people, in addition to being trained militarily, have to be trained in a wide variety and have a wide variety of other skills. Now, as far as these subsector operations are concerned, these are relatively new. At the present time, they've only been there about 4 months. At the present time, there are about 110 of these subsector teams working. From what I've seen of them, they're doing an extremely fine job, and the commander, or what is known as Comus McVie, he has an extremely high hope that these people will pay a high dividend, because they get down and they're at the grassroots of the operations and are working hand in glove with the people. Now then, the other U.S. military personnel, they are involved in such things as command and control, that is, in the headquarters, working alongside of the Vietnamese High Command. Some of them are in communications, some of them are in supply and logistics function to bring in the supplies that are necessary, and still others are providing the airlift and air support in support of the ground operations. Now then, what about the problems in South Vietnam? I would say that they are legion, and that there is not a single problem there that is easy of solution. I'll just mention a few of them to give you a general idea about the situation. First, in a situation such as this, the advantage always lays with the guerrilla or with the insurgent. He is not concerned with the economy of the area or its political stability. On the operational side, he has no territory or people to defend, and furthermore, he can choose the time and the place and so forth for conducting a raid or an ambush, and can take advantage of the terrain and the cover, and then if he is met by a superior force, he can simply fade into the background. This was exactly the situation that I was faced with in Burma, only I was on the other side. I was on the insurgent side at that time, and I can assure you that that is the case. With an effective intelligence net, the guerrilla often knows more about the enemy than the enemy knows about himself. The situation in Vietnam is further compounded by the fact that these activities were started many years ago. Actually, they were started as early as 1930. In addition, through their operations against the French, leading up to the final defeat or the climax at Dien Bien Phu, they have gained much knowledge and practical experience in the life of the insurgent. These people, the Viet Cong, they are professionals in this business. There's no doubt about it. And it's going to take a well thought out and effective counterinsurgency or counteractions to eliminate it. The terrain and the weather in South Vietnam is also a problem. You saw that the northern part was mountainous. The southern part is the delta area, which during the rainy season is under between 1 and 3 and 4 feet of water, all over, just like a sea of water. The annual rainfall in the various parts of the country varies between 100 and 250 inches of rain. Now, those of you who live in Southern California, where when you get 20 inches of rainfall during the course of a year, that's quite a bit of heavy rainfall. I think you can immediately appreciate the problem that 250 would inflict upon you. In addition, last October and November, the rainfall was particularly heavy in I and 2 Corps. They had as much as anywhere from 10 to 15 and in some places 20 inches of rainfall a day. And it just flushed out things, so to speak. And this required a great deal of medical care, housing, feeding, and so forth for the people. There were literally thousands and thousands of refugees which had to be cared for by the South Vietnamese government. One of the principal problems in South Vietnam are the various divisive factors. Within South Vietnam, with an overall population of something in excess of 14 million, there are about 12 million Vietnamese. But there are also some other ethnic groups as well. The Montagnards, for example, represent about 800,000. Then there are the Cambodians, and there are the Hmongs, and there are the Nungs. And then looking over religious-wise, we find first the Buddhists, and then the Catholics, and then you find these religious sects such as the Cao Dai and the Hao Hao, and then there are the animists, which worship these things in nature and so forth. The people of South Vietnam are further divided between those which originally came from South Vietnam and those which came down from the north after the defeat of the French. And also the labor unions and the students cause further division within the Vietnamese society. And I believe you can readily imagine that it's extremely difficult to get all of these groups, and each one of them has its own individual aspiration to try to get these people working together as a cohesive body. Socially speaking, it makes this problem that we have in the United States appear very, very minor. Another related problem is the instability of the government. Within the past 2 years, there have been 4 major and 2 minor, or what they now call demi-coups. Now, when one of these governments is put out of power, it just isn't a matter of taking out the premier and a couple of people up here in Saigon. This goes all the way through the chain of command. There's a chain of all the ministry, of all the commissions. There are changes in the military command, new corps commanders, new division commanders, and then down in the province, and sometimes as low as the district. So for a country which is already lacking in political and military leadership, and without a really highly trained group of civil servants, this instability or turbulence plays havoc with the already unstable functioning of a government. The war in South Vietnam is a tough war. It's a dog-eat-dog type of war, and both sides, the Viet Cong and the ARVN of South Vietnam, are taking heavy casualties. Since the people on both sides are Vietnamese, it is extremely difficult to know who the enemy actually is. It is often like fighting shadows or fighting windmills, sometimes almost like grasping whole hands of fresh air. Personally, however, I do not feel pessimistic about the situation. Much has been done in South Vietnam, much is being done, although still there is much to be done. It will require a high degree of statesmanship and diplomacy to develop and maintain a stable government in South Vietnam. Also, the armed forces must improve their operational techniques and their ability to work with the people and to win the hearts and the minds and the souls of the people to the government. If these things are done, I would feel that the situation is far from being hopeless. It will be a difficult and perhaps a prolonged conflict, but one that for the security of Vietnam, for the security of Southeast Asia, and for that matter, for the security of the remainder of the free world, I feel that it must be won. Thank you very much.
We'll take about a 2-minute break for those of you who have to go to 1 o'clock classes. For those of you who are leaving, I'd like to remind you that Harrison Salisbury will be speaking here tomorrow at 12 o'clock. Take about a 2-minute break.
Yeah, I would say 10 minutes would be plenty.
The general is on a limited schedule, so we'll only be able to go till 1:15, so hope you realize this. Have some questions, please? Yes. What is your question?
Yeah, my point is this, that it seems that the Vietnamese people there don't have really a will to defend themselves, or else this will is there and it's very minor. And isn't it true that, and I'm wondering, what is the United States there for? If Vietnamese people do not have the will, and has the United States effort so far failed in this aspect? And isn't this really the main point that we have to do?
Let me repeat the question.
All right.
After a brief introduction, the gentleman asked if the Vietnamese people have a adequate will, or if this has been developed adequately by the United States Army, and if this is the basic problem.
I think you will find that this will vary from place to place. I don't doubt but what there are situations, such as this one, not so much at Pleiku, but in this other one. And this was not a Vietnamese Army unit. This actually was one of the regional force units, which is one of the lower levels. This was a regrettable situation. There's just no doubt about it. But this is some of the difficulties working down on that level. This actually was working down on the subsector area where this took place. Generally speaking, however, though, I personally, from what I've seen of it and what I've heard about it and what I've read about it, as far as the Vietnamese soldier is concerned, he is a fine fighting soldier. When he's trained, he gets in there and he scraps it out with the Viet Cong on better than equal terms. So much depends upon training and much depends upon leadership. That, I think, is a solution to the problem in South Vietnam. One of the problems.
Yes, in the blue coat. Oh.
Do you think the strikes against North Vietnam by air, to hit the supply lines to the north, would be an effective means of controlling perhaps Communist Chinese intervention in the air? Should they be intensified or continue or both to ensure the cutoff of supply to the north?
Gentleman asked on the effectiveness of the airstrikes against North Viet Cong supply lines, and should these be increased as an effective measure?
Well, first, I'm sure you recognize that the strikes which have taken place, they have not been directed against what you have indicated. They have been reprisal strikes which have been directed against military installations. As far as the other things, as far as going further north and bombing further north to knock out their supply and their transportation routes and so forth, I would like to defer that because I would have to get into some rather technical and security matters, and I don't think I should do that here this morning.
Yes.
How close is the Vietnam situation to activating
The gentleman asked how close the Vietnamese situation is to activating the American Reserve units.
I can truthfully say that I can't answer your question.
I think the general show that questions of this sort, it's impossible to answer, but you're just asking speculative questions. Sir.
Do you feel that there will be increased use of the helicopters with American pilots rather than simply the ground actors that we've seen in Vietnam, or if operations against Vietnam?
I don't know whether there will be an increase in the number of helicopters there or not. I would say that of what they have, they're going to take maximum advantage of them because it does provide them a quick reacting force where you can get, if you discover something, you can get these forces and move them in very quickly. And the Vietnamese have worked very good on these heliborne type operations.
Yes, the young lady. The lady asked what the chief arguments against having elections in Vietnam are.
I would say that, generally speaking, it's the instability. Even if you did have an election, very likely the elected government would be thrown out of power or could be thrown out of power. It's this instability that is causing a tremendous problem, really, because these people, just like you, I, or anybody else, they like to have something to rally around. As a matter of fact, whether you have an insurgency or whether you have a counterinsurgency, it's very necessary to have this stability, something, a cause, a hope, something to work for, you see. And that is why this unstable situation in Vietnam has caused so much difficulty, both on the political side and on the military side. As long as you have that, I don't see how you could possibly have a free election. Well, you see, I would say which group? Because you take any group and they immediately divide down into other groups, you see. Now, perhaps first you have to recognize that you're really only talking about the Vietnamese. You can put aside the Montagnards and these other ethnic groups, but talking about the 12 million Vietnamese themselves. They're divided religious-wise, you see, into Catholics and Buddhists. The Catholics have the great preponderance of the money and the business, and the Buddhists generally are the farmers and the agrarians, you see. And then you have these same people further subdivided into those which were there and those which came down from the north. And this gets mixed up with this religious question too. So frankly, I don't think there's any single group that can do this. Now, it's been said in the paper that the Buddhists, of course, they've toppled the government. They felt they toppled the government on a couple times, but they've never been strong enough to maintain a government because the Catholics are almost equally as strong. So that becomes a problem.
Some attachés and military personnel have estimated that the airstrikes in South Vietnam have caused from 30 to 50% civilian casualties. Could you tell me, A, who commanded the airstrikes, and B, whether these against personnel targets will be discontinued now that the war is gone to North Vietnam?
Did everybody hear the question?
Well, I can tell you who commands them, but I can't tell you whether they're going to stop these or not. They're not directed at these villages. I think this is one of the first things that you must recognize. There are certain areas of South Vietnam which are completely Viet Cong or communist dominated and controlled to the last man. These are the war zones, which are well known. And the communists sit back in there with their defenses and so on, and they run the government, they collect the taxes, it's completely communist. Now, the Americans do not direct these strikes. These strikes, if they be such, would have to be run by the higher order of the Vietnamese government. Beyond that, I can't answer your question.
We'll take two more questions. Yes, sir.
Sir, you spoke about the morale of the Vietnamese soldier.
You asked me one question or two. I don't know you lost me with the ghosts.
Yeah, these are C-123s that operate. I remember one of our planes crashed with a load of air commandos piloted by American personnel with American infantry support on them. These are sort of like long-range penetration groups in North Vietnam.
Where did the airplane crash?
They crashed in takeoff in South Vietnam.
I can't answer your question on that one, so we'll leave out the ghosts. With respect to the other, it's true that this past month, those which are not classified as desertions but which are classified as missing in action, I don't think they'll get up quite to the figure that you've indicated, but in one instance in Vinh Dinh province, there were and it's been written in a paper, so I'm not telling you anything security-wise that you can't read. There were three companies that were hit real hard by the Viet Cong. They suffered quite heavy casualties. The Viet Cong suffered more than a few casualties in that one too, but for the greater part, these companies were broken up, and there were very few people that survived or were able to straggle back, you might say. Since that time, they have reinforced this area with some additional troops, and the situation has been stabilized. I think we will find these situations where people, when they're surrounded and so forth, and when you get into one of these ambushes, which are very difficult to locate, and you get these guns looking right down your throat, they might find some of these cases where some of these people will be called missing in action. They undoubtedly do defect and go over. This all depends, again, on leadership. There are other units that'll fight right down to the last man. So, again, the problem here is not as simple as saying this one situation is typical, because it is not atypical. It is an isolated situation.
Last question. Yes. Please stand up.
You said that all the factions in South Vietnam were split down into sub-factions. This goes with Vietnam.
What did you say?
You want to know if the Viet Cong were split, like you described the Vietnamese were split down in factions.
No, I wouldn't say that they are. There are factions here, however, not to the same degree. I would say that the principal divisive factor there are those which are from the south and those which are from the north. Aside from that, I don't think that they will have these problems, I'm sure, but they don't have it, I don't think, to the same degree that the South Vietnamese government has it.
Thank you very much.